Welcome to the R7 podcast, sponsored by M is Good. R7 is an innovative, God-inspiring process that explores personal and professional purpose. R7 analyzes 7 strategies to transform your vision and find direction in your organizational marketing. R7 establishes clarity and guidance for the gift we call life. Welcome to the R7 podcast. I am so excited to bring in Karen and Moore into the podcast today. I am without my sidekick, David, today. So, Dave, if you're watching, which I know you are, I miss you. I love you. You didn't get to meet Karen, but I want to bring Karen in here. Karen, thank you so much for joining the podcast today. I'm gonna do this intro here, and I know it probably won't do it justice, but man, you are the devotional woman of God for the past 15 years or so.
Yeah, 20 years. Yeah.
20 years. You've got over 100 titles with your name on it.
I do.
You've been in publishing for 25 years, right?
Mm-hmm.
My gosh, the 1 minute, 5 minute, 10 minute, 25-minute devotional, you've got it.
Yeah, we call that daily, 30 days, 10 days, however many days, but mostly
Wow.
I do dailies. So
Thanks for joining me today.
you're welcome. Great to be here.
I've had also the pleasure of working on my next book with Karen. And so we've had a blast writing the next book. The title's still TBD.
Secret.
Top secret, but it is a sequel to Vision Wins, and I'm excited to release that the 1st of January, and so very excited to talk about that. I just really want to hear from you. I know our audience out there of other men and women of God that have a vision from the Lord are looking to write a book, self-publish a book, get a publisher. I'd just love to hear from you on, your approach to messaging and specifically with devotionals or however you want to take it. Just love to hear from you. Yeah.
Okay. Well, I guess, if we're talking to people who are looking at how to get started or how they might also get their books out there, I think one of the key things first is just to genuinely have a great desire to do it because it's a lot of work. No book just shows up on the shelf. It takes so many people a lot of times to help make a book come together. It takes a lot of late nights and a lot of prayers and a lot of trying to figure out if you're on the right track and are you taking the reader somewhere that's good. So there's a lot that goes into it. So my first caution is really, boy, make sure you want to do it before you start because it takes something out of you and you have to give a lot to it. So
on the podcast here, we've talked a lot over the last, I don't know, 4 or 5 different sessions about messaging and vision and strategy. And, messaging is such a huge part of everything that we do in the world. What would you say when you're talking about your message in a devotional context? What are the key elements that you try to build on or you try to search for in your heart that you want to get out? Like, what would you say?
That's a good question. I think sometimes it depends on who my target reader is. So, I've done devotional books that are primarily for women. I've done some that are basically for teens. So I've had different readers that I'm going after, and that does change a little bit the thinking. But I would say no matter who the reader is, there are a few things that I'm always out to do. One is to be sure that the reader gets one important message, one idea, one understanding, one new perception, one new prayer that maybe they've never thought about before, or a scripture that they've never landed on that now means something to them that it didn't. So typically a devotional book is going to start with a theme idea. So there's one main idea. And then it's going to have a scripture. Typically, it's going to end with a prayer, or some of mine end with a question. How does this relate to your life? How is this, how will you put this into effect? So I start with those elements of knowing that I have a brief space to give one meaningful message, one clear idea, so they can go away from that and think about it.
Over the years, Bruce has really coached me up on um, this idea of self-publishing versus a publisher.
Hmm.
And I don't know if he remembers telling me this, but it has rocked me for years. When you're self-published, you really tend to write about yourself. And understanding what that one thing is that you're talking about is really, really hard to do because, as a self-publisher, I think sometimes we get caught up in everybody wants to hear my story, right? And
Yeah.
so, but and your family probably does want to hear your story or they want to hear the devotional from your eyes, but how do you get outside of that family circle and pull somebody in with that one key theme has got to be really hard.
One of the tricks, or at least one of the things I learned early on, and this came from my greeting card writing background, which we can talk a little more about as we
Yeah.
go on. But when you are having to write in a very short space, let's say you have to write a sympathy card. In my case, I wrote thousands of greeting cards. So sometimes I would have to literally put myself in the place of that reader. What are the emotions that are going on at this point in their lives? What are the things that they might fear? What are the things that they need to know? And how can I bring comfort to that person? And so, as a writer, the very first thing I have to do is project out to somebody I don't know, but somebody that I want to relate to, that I
Mhm.
want them to feel like I'm coming right beside them and I want to help them get through whatever they're going through. So that training helped me a lot as a book writer.
Mm. And what would you say, like, what is one key tool, like getting your message down? What would you say? Is it prayer? Is it the message? Is it the length of the theme? Like,
In
how many?
terms of
Yeah,
actually the book together, or
yeah,
getting the idea together,
yeah.
you know, Dave, probably the thing that I do, and I don't know if all writers do this, but anytime I start a project, I don't write a word until I've done a few things. One is prayer.
Yeah.
I try to pray out, what would God have me say? What are the kinds of things that people need to be reminded of? You
Mhm.
know, I have to confess that I tend to write things I need to hear. And I usually think, if I needed to learn this or if I need to know this, maybe somebody else does too. And
Yeah.
I put all that in the mix of things.
Mm.
But the other thing I do is I am big on doing a keyword dump with myself. So I start with just a brain dump of everything that matches the theme. I had one devotional book that I was asked to do, and the publisher said, would you do as many water images as you can come up with? It was a daily devotional, 366. So what did I do? Well, I I looked at the word water, and then I went and thought of every possible way I could talk about, mist and, ice and rain and, all kinds of ways to look at water. And then I looked for scriptures that would work in that context. So I try to build myself a cheat sheet so that when I start writing, I have some tools. Because if I just started writing
Mm.
cold, it wouldn't be long and I'd be going, gosh, I'm only on number 37 and I think I've said everything I thought I would say. So I can't do it that way. I have to build a list. So if I have 366 devotions to write, you can believe I have a 366 word list that I also have written. And I did that first.
Wow, that's awesome. So you have that word list, and then you take that word list and you back it up with some imagery of what the
Um,
potential imagery could be. Not all 366, right? But
no.
just yeah.
Sometimes I do that. Sometimes I take that word list and that'll help me to choose scripture that I want to use. Sometimes it helps me look for a literary quote that I might want to use in the book. So if I'm knowing, if I know that I have key words that are just really going to pop and help the reader understand the concept or the theme of the book, that's just my way of helping me get there and make sure I get to every nuance of that I can think of.
Being a strong woman of God that you are, how do you balance the spiritual side of it, the spiritual messaging side of that versus, the actual word list?
Mhm. You know what? I think that is something that has evolved in me, to be honest, over
Mm,
time and experience. Because initially, I think I wrote because I was trying to please the publisher, I guess, which might not be nice to say right out loud. But the fact is that over time I've learned that my readers are just so important to me that I want to speak to their hearts. And each reader is going to come to this book with a unique faith, right? Because I don't know if any of us could define our faith exactly for each other,
mm,
but when you read something that at least resonates with you because you have experience or you have heard that it's familiar in some way or it's comforting to you or it inspires your heart, that's what I'm after more so than I don't know if they're a beginning believer or they're well seasoned. Those are things that over time I've just tried to balance in any book I do. Have some for people who might be new and some for those who've been, studying and getting into devotion for a long time.
mm. And what do you think the biggest struggle and biggest opportunity in that space is where you think, okay, this could be for me, or, like in terms of reaching a more seasoned Christian or non-seasoned Christian? Like, do you feel like there's examples of where you've really missed it and examples of like you've really succeeded through it?
Well, I'll tell you, when I go back and look at some of the first books I wrote, I
Yeah.
think I wonder if I even dare to read them because I feel like, oh my, that I think I've grown since I wrote that.
Mm, right.
But what I do find, which is also helpful in some way, is that even some of those early books, I will still get a note from somebody or a letter from somebody telling me, you know what, I just found this in, a bargain bin,
Uh,
and I love it, and this is why. So I can't always know, what's going to work for someone else. I
mm,
have to trust that God has given me enough bandwidth to try very hard to meet the needs of a lot of people. So you ask how I know some did work. I do have a couple of examples.
yeah.
Well, one is that I did this book called It's Still Possible. And I love this book because the idea of it is that it has 100 readings. And in these 100 readings, I'm trying to remind all of us that it doesn't matter what our age or stage or what has happened to us in the past. What matters is where do we want to go now? Where do we
Mm,
want to go in the future? How do we step forward? And sometimes we get so caught up with what I didn't do that we struggle with, could I possibly do anything or what else could I do? So when I wrote this book and it first came out, and I have gotten really some awesome reviews and awesome comments from people, which I appreciate so much. But one came from a guy who told me that he was in his 50s. He had just become so discouraged with life and so many things that just didn't seem to be going right. And of course, COVID hit and everybody was stuck at home. And there were all these feelings that I'm just going nowhere and nothing felt possible. And when that book came out, just about that time, this guy sent me the most beautiful note. It made me cry.
mm,
He said, "You have made me believe things are possible again, and I'm
mm.
ready to go
Praise
try."
God.
And that just did so it did so much for me. I just felt like I can do this. I'm going to keep doing it because there's that guy. He's out there somewhere, and I want to make sure he understands that with God all things are possible. And So I do my best to try to help people remember some of those things that they actually once knew or maybe even believed but have let go of. Another book that I did, and it wasn't a book that ever found its way to very many shelves, I suspect. It was for teen girls, and it was called True Images for Teen Girls. I wrote it for Zondervan. I thought that it was great fun to write it. I have to tell you, I was nervous about writing it because, here I was going to write a book for teen girls, and I was, somewhat apart from being a teen. It had been a while since I was a teen. And I thought, oh my, how do I do this? How do I address this young audience and say something that's helpful to them?
Mm.
So, of course, the first thing I had to do was research. I had to go out and find some understanding of what are those issues, what are the things that teen girls worry about today, because they're very different from when I was a teen girl. So, what should I be addressing? How can I help them? So, I spent some time looking at and listening to and reading other work that was out there so that I could understand that reader and say something to girls. Because teen girl books are, girls who are 8 and 9 want to read teen girl books because they want to be
Mm.
grown up, right? So the audience is a wider range than you might think. And anyway, one reader of that book at a time when I was just in that space of I'm thinking, oh, maybe I've done all God wants me to do. Maybe I don't, time to hang up my spurs or whatever we might say. I started to think, maybe I just shouldn't do this anymore.
Mm.
And it was that very day I got an email. This just had to be a God thing for me. I got an email from this girl in Florida, and she said, I just wanted to thank you for writing this book called True Images for Teen Girls. She said, I'm 16. And she said, I've been struggling with anorexia since I was 13, and I did not think I would survive.
Mm.
And so
Wow.
I'm already, wow, listening to her story. She pointed out at least two different sections of the book that had been truly meaningful to her. And then she said, I've been healed of anorexia. And I just
Wow.
want every girl I know to read this book.
Praise God. That's awesome.
Wow. It was like a wow. I was weeping for, it just was so amazing to me to have that happen. And so some of that is what helps me keep going. It's been wonderful. Sometimes I get frustrated with this whole internet thing, but other times I love it because people from all over the world will send me messages that I probably wouldn't get otherwise.
What I hear you saying is that, to start a book project, whether it's a devotional or your story or whatever it is you're trying to do, you start with prayer, right?
Hmm.
Start with the prayer, do
Yes,
your research, right? Do
yes,
your research on the subject. And when
yeah.
you're doing the research on this, I think this is so important because I think a lot of times people just sit down and write a book, tell their story, and they just don't know how to tell a story that arcs. They don't have to tell a story based on
Hmm.
context. I think you and I have talked about that in our book is that like we
Yeah.
got to add like historical context to the book, pull the
Hmm.
reader in. My question for you is when you're doing the research, are you researching other books like it to see what could be different about your book? Are you researching the actual topic? Like what kind of research are you doing?
It's all of the above.
Okay.
Typically what I like to do is I like to say, first of all, what's on Amazon, right? Because that's the one of the biggest possible places to check what books are out there. So I'll start there and I'll
Mhm.
read through book titles that are classified in the same genre or the same direction, or they're, something that's on that topic. And I'll look to see what looks like it might be similar to what I'm going to try to do. And if it looks kind of similar, then I'll open it up if they have some review pages and look at it and see what approach did they take.
Mhm.
And most of the time I'll discover, oh, their approach is nothing like what I was going to do. They just took it a whole different direction, which is the beauty of writing books. Okay. So I look to see is it similar, but I also look to see if it's If mine is different, what kind of difference do I want it to make? How do I want it to reach that audience in a way that perhaps the other person didn't really wasn't looking at? They were meeting a need from a different direction than I am. So I just try to look at that and get a sense of that. And after I've done a few of those, read a few of those, then I have a sense of, okay, this feels like I can go forward with this because it's going to offer something new to the market in a sense, and it's going to help readers in a different way than some of these others do.
I would just want to keep on, kind of pressing in on this because I think it's important. Because the reason I think it's important is I get these questions all the time. We
Right.
get emails from people all around the world. In fact, I was on a call last night at 7 o'clock at night my time, 9 o'clock a.m. Australian time, for a potential writer who's looking to take his book to the U.S. market.
Hmm.
And of course, I'm going to read the book and I'm going to, look at it. But I'm like, here we go again. Is this a
Yeah.
self-published book about the self? And
Yeah.
are we trying to push a book that's just not going to relate? And this, last thing I want to do is spend a bunch of money and having the client spend a bunch of money in retainer and messaging fees, and it just doesn't go anywhere. And
Right.
so I think this is super helpful. When if we think about that person who's never written a book before, or is just starting a project, how would you, or what would you say to them, after they've done the praying and
It's
done the
interesting.
research, and now they start writing, right? They get their theme, they get their one message down. What do you think about a ghostwriter or an editor? I know some people say, "Man, I don't wanna spend $5,000, $10,000 to bring in somebody who can write. I'll just do it myself. I can write. I was great in English in 3rd grade. I can write." You know,
Yeah.
what do you
Well,
say to that? What do you say to that?
those are two questions to me. So
Okay.
let me try the first one and then the second one.
Alright.
So the first question, Bruce and I do a lot of writers conferences. And we often meet with writers one on one, and they get 10 minutes or 5 minutes or 8 minutes, whatever the conference gives them, to give us their pitch, tell us what they're writing,
Okay.
why are they writing it, all of that. Well, we've done hundreds of those.
Okay. Awesome.
And so the thing that we most often will ask is, what is the one thing that you want the reader to take away from the book you want to write? What is that one thing? Just one. And if they can't tell us what their book is about or what they want the reader to take away, then they shouldn't be writing yet. Because before you begin, you need to know where it's going to go and why you want to get there and why you want the reader to get there. So it's very important. I think one of the things that often new writers do is they start writing before they should be writing.
That's
There's
great.
so much
Great advice.
uh,
Great.
so much upfront work to
Yeah.
do before you start writing. One of the things that we often say, but I'm not sure if all of us as writers do this, we just need to keep reading lots of people's writing too,
Mm.
because when you read other genres, you read other people's styles, sometimes that'll resonate with you and you'll realize, wow, this is actually a way I would like to tell a story,
Yeah.
or this is something that is meaningful to me and I see how they did that, and I'm going to try to put that in my next book. So if you're not a reader, I think it's kind of hard to be a really good
Writer.
writer,
Yeah. That's great.
because you don't know what you're not bringing to the table. So I think being a reader is important. I think also knowing who you want to touch with that book.
Mhm.
Who is that person? Who are those people that I want this to be meaningful for? Because if you don't know who they are, why bother writing? It's just going to be too, where's it going to go and who's going to pick it up? So I think those are very important things to figure out before you even do the first thing. And then after you start writing, I think it's always good to do a one page, here's my overview of what I think this book is going to be about. And so you take and you do one nice, maybe a couple pages, and it's just stream of conscious. You're not worrying about your grammar and all that other stuff. You're just going, this is the kind of thing I want this book to be about. Because all of that solidifies your direction when you start to really put it out. As you know, that Bruce Barber is very big on proposals for a book.
Yeah.
And the reason he's big on that is because writers need to know where they want to go. And if you do a good proposal, it's going to say, this is the premise. This is some of the key concepts, the key phrases. These are the 10 chapters, and here's a couple sentences about each chapter. Then you know what's happening, and it's very, very helpful, especially when you're a new writer, because it's easy to get sidetracked and get yourself off on a tangent that had nothing to do with the book at all. And then finally somebody reads it and says, yeah, I got lost over here on chapter 6 because I didn't know where that was going. And, so we don't always recognize it if we don't have some kind of a plan. So it's good to plan out where you're
I
going to go.
I have a personal story of
Okay.
exactly what you're saying here. So, I love John Gordon. I've read all of John Gordon's books. His biggest book, I think, is called Energy Bus. He's also written The Carpenter, and, he writes his book in fable, like in a
Yes.
fable structure, and, just a big fan of his, and I had an opportunity many years ago to be his escort, I guess, around a conference.
Uh-huh.
And so we had a little bit of downtime, and I just asked him, "How do you write a book?" And he actually laid out to me the steps of how he wrote a book, and I took those steps and I just wrote them down. And it wasn't until like a couple years later I said, "You know what? I'm gonna follow John Gordon's sort of recipe and how he does it."
Yes.
And
Yeah.
and Karen, what you're saying is exactly what he does. Is he comes up with the big idea, and then he allows the next 6 to 8 months of different situations to fill in different scenarios and venues to fill in where the story's gonna
Yeah.
take place, and then he basically builds out all the characters, like, the character, their parents, their
Mm-hmm.
children, their
Mm-hmm.
occupations, and he's got this big schematic, and then once he gets all that together and he feels real comfortable about, like, you know, all those elements, he then writes the book.
Mm-hmm.
He does
Mm-hmm.
all the research and
That,
exactly what you're saying. It's just a
and,
beautiful
and
process.
And it doesn't mean that that process won't open up to some bigger direction and other ideas. And some of your characters might go different directions than you even think when you start out. But that's all okay. You have to have a place to start and a place to go back to when you're stuck.
Yes.
Because what happens to all writers at some point is they get to
Mhm.
a certain place and then they're not sure where to go. And if you've got some kind of roadmap for yourself, you can read through it and say, oh, yeah, this is where I was going to do X. And you can get back on track and get back to writing. You asked about ghostwriters and working with
Yes.
other
Yes.
writers. I think that can be extremely beneficial. And it also can be tricky because you have to have a really good match. I mean, you have to have, first of all, you have to have um, a two-way street between yourself and a ghostwriter. You have to be willing to let that writer have some say in a direction that maybe you weren't even sure that was where it would go.
Mm.
They have to be able to listen to you in return. And that combination isn't always easy, for a collaborator or a ghostwriter or someone trying to tell a story. It's maybe easier if there's not like a lot of story already written and this other person is just trying to do a substantive edit perhaps, or broaden it, develop it to some degree. So it's all about that relationship, I think. But some ghost writers are really good at capturing your voice, and voice in any book is very important. And by voice we mean, how does the reader receive, what tone does it take, what how does it resonate with them? Have we shared a story that melts their hearts in the right places, or makes them
Mhm.
laugh, or causes them to think through something that was said that could be profound for them. So that voice of either coming alongside or being a friend or being a teacher, depending on what kind of voice you're after, sometimes you want a teachy, preachy voice. Um, Typically not in most novels or books of that sort. But, I have to watch that a lot in writing devotional books. I have to be careful that I don't suddenly become on my own little preachy soap opera. I've got to go, whoa, wait a second. This isn't about me. This is about my reader. So, and that's not always easy.
So, in a real world application of having a
Yeah.
good writer to write a story for you, how do you feel we did in our book together?
Dave, I was so proud of us. And
Okay.
and and I say proud of us because I didn't know and you didn't know.
Right.
I suspect. How is this going to work? Will we both agree with how it's moving forward? But what I loved is that we talked, we communicated, we set up time, and we shared where the story was going and what else we thought the story might need. And did this character resonate well? Or, we just kind of reviewed some of that.
Mhm.
And also tried to keep in mind what is the key takeaway that you want the book to have,
Mhm.
and then what kind of key did I want the book to have.
Yeah.
It was also important because, of course, in our case, we're trying to write a novel, which is a little different than a teaching, instructional,
Mhm.
how-to kind of book. We weren't writing that. Um, we weren't trying to use a formula to make something work. We were trying to tell a story in a way that would feel very real, very honest, and very appropriate for the kind of reader we were after. And I think it was a joint effort to help us both realize what that sounded like and what it needed to be. And you made some excellent suggestions along the way that just inspired my next thoughts. And I hope I made some for you that made it help you see how it could go and how it could evolve.
I would agree with you 1000%. I think it was very reassuring that you were behind it and giving it structure and giving it the time and the ability for the story to breathe.
Hmm.
And I feel like I would have rushed that. And so that's what I was really grateful that you were able to really
Thank
just have the time and let it air out and let it breathe and let it come together, which I
Well, and as I told Bruce, it was interesting to me in putting the book together that how invested I felt in these characters. It
yeah.
was like I want them to work things out. I want the crisis they're going through to be okay. So
Yeah.
I had to feel that,
Mm.
not just want it for them, but feel it. And in some times, like in all writing, and you probably know this yourself, that sometimes the writing takes you somewhere you weren't even knowing it would go. It wasn't what you thought you planned, but it's what made sense when you got there. It was kind of like I didn't need to see that turn around the bend until I got around the bend, and then, oh, I could see where it was going to go. And I
Yeah.
loved that about it. So that was great.
I think my advice to people out there that are listening and considering writing a book, and they get a vision of the Lord like really wanting this
Mm-hmm.
story to come out of them because they're going to affect hundreds of thousands, maybe millions of people. I go back to Story Brand, and I think we talked about this a couple years ago. Um, Story Brand came out, and it just really kind of revolutionized how we tell a story in terms of messaging. And this one thing really sticks with me is that the organization is no longer the hero, the client, the donor, the first time guest. They are the hero. You, the organization, are their guide. And I
Mm-hmm.
think about that, if we just change it just a little bit, as the author of your one theme and idea, you are guiding somebody
Yeah.
through the story. You are not the story.
No.
And that's what I feel like John Gordon does so well with books, is that he really pulls you in. I think our book pulls you in too,
Mm-hmm.
in terms
Mm-hmm.
of we're trying to really take that lens and put it on the reader, not on the author.
Hmm. And that our key characters are helping that reader to see themselves somewhere in there. I think that's one of the joys of writing that kind of book, is to create enough characters so that different ones can resonate with different readers at different
Yes.
levels of their faith experience. So, and I was grateful that the intention of that book was to help this young woman, our protagonist, to help her understand what her faith really meant to her and to make
Hmm.
it personal. And by the end of the book, of course, that's exactly where she goes. But I've read a lot of Christian fiction, and I would say that today it's gotten to be much, much better than it used to be. It used to be somewhat formula driven, and there was always a sense that you kind of knew certain things would have to happen. It was predictable in that way. And I guess that's okay. It works. Works for romance fiction, I guess. But what I was hoping for, and I think what we achieved, is coming up with a character that was truly struggling, even though they were very successful in life and had seemed to have it all together, still struggling about this one big question in life, which had to do with discovering God for themselves. So
Yeah.
I think we brought that to life. I'm very
Yeah.
excited about it. So.
Yeah. We're going to close out the podcast here. So, Karen, I'd love for you to just share some words of wisdom for those people out there that are listening or watching, and thinking about starting a project like this, starting a book, whatever that book may be or that devotion may be. I know we talked about prayer and research and a one page and understanding your theme, but what would you say to them? I'll give you the last word here as we shut down the podcast.
I think I would encourage anyone who feels that God is calling you to write to say that your voice could make a difference. If it's one person or 100 people or 1,000 people, your way of approaching a topic that's been approached 100 times before might come out different for somebody that's seeing it for the first time. So, you don't have to worry about, is this topic already done and I shouldn't write about it? Because no one will write about it the way you will write about it.
Mm,
So, as long as you're approaching your project with an open mind, in the sense of, I too am willing to be led while I do it,
mm,
that I'm not doing this because I think I have all the answers. I'm doing this because I believe God has something to say, and I just want to be his hands and feet. I want to help bring this to light. And we live in a pretty upside down world, and the more of us who want to turn things to the light, I applaud that. So I say, go for that, but do your homework. Be willing to learn from other people who have experience. Be willing to be guided, because none of us do anything that we do that somebody didn't help us get there. And so let people help you.
that's awesome. Thanks again for joining us. I want to give special thanks to our sponsor, M is Good. Want to learn more about M is Good? Go to misgood.com. Join us again next week as we continue to uncover the secrets to success with faith-based testimonies and the power of R7. Remember, destiny awaits, but time does not.